Welcome to Hershey's Mill Community TV. I'm delighted today to have two guests, Dr. Amanda Burdan from Brandywine Museum of Art in Chaddsford, Pennsylvania, and Emily Silber from the Wharton Esherick Museum in Malvern, Pennsylvania. We're here today to talk about an exhibition that will be opening October 13th of this year, running through January 19th of 2025, called The Crafted World of Wharton Esherick. Some of you who have been to the museum before will recognize the museum that is behind us on the screen. But this exhibition will be held at the Brandywine Museum of Art. I'd like to give you a little background about our speakers because we are very privileged to have them here today. I'll start with Dr. Amanda Burdan. She is a specialist in American art and senior curator at Brandywine Museum of Art, caring for both the collection of American art and the museum's historic properties, including the N.C. Wyeth House and Studio, the Andrew Wyeth Studio, and the Kerner Farm. She is also supervisor of the museum's Walter and Lenore Annenberg Research Center. She has organized a number of exhibitions, most recently the work of Jamie Wyeth in an exhibition entitled Jamie Wyeth Unsettled. Some of you may have seen that this spring, which is currently touring the country, which is really a feather in your cap. She also orchestrated a recreation of Jamie's 1965 studio within the Andrew Wyeth Studio in 2023. At Brandywine, she curates a rotating exhibition of Wyeth's work in a dedicated gallery alongside the works of his grandfather, N.C. Wyeth. Her interest in the transatlantic influences of American art inform her two recent exhibitions and catalogs. Number one, America's Impressionism, Echoes of a Revolution in 2021, and Rural Modern, American Art Beyond the City in 2016. Both exhibitions examined the adoption and adaptation of European styles of art to suit the American public and critical taste in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Amanda joined the curatorial staff of the Brandywine River Museum of Art in 2012 and previously worked in the curatorial departments of the Florence Griswold Museum, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and Rhode Island School of Design Museum of Art. She, since completing her dissertation on the role of women artists in the formation of Americans' cultural identity in the post-Civil War era at Brown University, she has continued to investigate the lives and work of women in her curatorial practice and research. In 2020, some of you may remember that she organized the exhibition Votes for Women, A Visual History, in honor of the centennial of the 19th Amendment. And her recent publications include essays on May Alcott Nyriker, did I say that correctly? And Doris Lee. Mm-hmm. All right, welcome, Amanda.
Thank you so much.
We are delighted. And not to, I don't want to ignore Emily's incredible credentials, so bear with me. I'd like to properly introduce Emily, who is Director of Curatorial Affairs and Strategic Partnerships at Wharton Esherick Museum. She is a curator, a consultant, and an educator. As director, she stewards the Esherick's legacy, including by facilitating conversations between contemporary makers and the historic site. And if you visited recently, you will have seen several of these extraordinary exhibits. Upcoming projects include this Crafted World of Wharton Esherick, which is a traveling exhibition opening at the Brandywine Museum of Art with an accompanying catalog. And I can say that this catalog is really outstanding. The photography is beautiful, professionally done, and all of the essays very readable and exciting to read. In addition to her work with the Wharton Esherick Museum, Silber also maintains an independent artist consulting practice. I don't know how you have time for all that. She has taught courses in craft and design history. She has taught curatorial studies and professional practice at institutions, including Tyler School of Art and Architecture, and has served as guest curator for the Renwick Gallery of the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Wow, that's a great museum too. For almost a decade, she was the first Warnick Curator of Contemporary Decorative Arts at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, where she built an integrated curatorial program for craft and design within the museum's contemporary art department. Prior, she held curatorial positions and fellowships at Cranbrook Academy of Art and Art Museum, the Museum of Arts and Design, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Emily holds a BA in Art History from the University of Chicago and an MA in the History of Decorative Arts and Design from the Bard Graduate Center. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you for having us.
This is just really exciting because I love the work of Wharton Esherick and I love the Brandywine. And many of you I know have visited the Brandywine, but this is going to be a very special exhibition. So we'll start at the top, and let's talk about how did the idea for this exhibition originate?
Well, Emily, it was originally meant to be a print show, right?
Very small.
Very small.
Really?
It was just going to be about the prints that Wharton Esherick made, the woodcuts. To some of us in the museum, they were great discoveries. We knew about his furniture making, but we thought, oh, here's a secret aspect of his life.
Well, and that's what you have in the Brandywine's collection, is a print by Esherick. He's represented there by work on paper rather than the furniture.
Right.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Is that going to be coming out for this show?
Yeah, I'll find a place to put it.
Good. All right.
But we thought, well, this will be a lovely print show. But as more people from the museum began working on it, different staff members got involved, we just kept coming back and back to visit Wharton Esherick, and we said, well, we can't really do this without at least one piece of furniture, without at least one sculpture, without at least, a painting or a frame, and it grew and grew and grew. And so it really became much more of an overview of the themes that were important to Esherick in his career, instead of just being about one kind of art that he made.
So for our viewing audience, about how long did this take? Because I know that these ideas...
Were we working on this before the pandemic? I don't remember.
I don't know if it was before the pandemic, but it was multiple years.
Yes.
So the first conversations about this very small exhibition were at least 2 years ago, if not more than that.
Yeah.
It's typical for a major exhibition like
To
this
take
to
this
take
time.
4 or 5 years in development.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Now, I understand the exhibition is organized in thematic vignettes. So please tell us about these different themes.
I'm happy to take that, sure. Well, so I'll take a step back and say one of the reasons we wanted to organize the exhibition thematically rather than chronologically or rather than by media is that, like, I think we had this conversation when we walked in, most people think of Esherick primarily as an artist who works in wood. And he's an artist who works across media. He's an artist who had thematic interests that he explored not only across his entire life, but also across all of the media he worked in. And so organizing the exhibition thematically really gave us a chance to emphasize how diverse and interdisciplinary of an artist he was. And so we're looking in the exhibition at Esherick's relationship to pattern, how he's using pattern and repetition, whether it's a beautiful kind of geometric pattern in a print or the pattern of wood grain to make an argument through the work that he's making. Esherick is somebody who is best known as a kind of rural artist, right? Because he escaped the city. He came out to Valley Forge Mountain when it was not in proximity to the King of Prussia Mall, but was just farmland, right? And so, but the reality is Esherick, as much as he cultivated a rural identity, had these deep and interesting ties to urban artistic movements, to urban artists and designers and writers, and so we're talking about that tension between the urban and the rural in his work. We're going to look at the body. Because Esherick is best known for furniture, we don't often think of him as somebody who's heavily influenced by the body and the figural form, but Esherick spent much of his career learning from dancers, studying dancers. He trained as a painter. He painted all sorts of portraits. And so the body is in those works of art as much as it's in the furniture. And so we look into that. And then Esherick, for his entire career, was focused on taking the laws of nature, how things grow, the way that a twisting kind of a root shooting out of the earth becomes this kind of bigger tree, and adapting those principles into the work that he made. And so looking at how natural principles are brought into what he makes, whether it is a print, whether it's a prop for a piece of set design, he worked closely with the Hedgerow Theatre, or whether it's one of his iconic pieces of furniture. We're really excited to explore all of those themes.
That is really exciting.
Yeah.
So Esherick made his house and studio over a 40-year period, correct?
Yes, this was a life's work.
Yes. So how were the works selected for the exhibition, since they rarely leave the Valley Forge mountain property?
Sure. So I think the Esherick Museum's collection numbers over 3,000 objects, which folks don't, necessarily know that. Many of them are not able to be seen in the studio. And so we really looked at this as an opportunity to take some of the things that our audiences love the most and to share them in a different context at Brandywine, and at the same time to bring out things that are hidden in our collection so that people could see. So I went through the studio, we worked with Amanda and the Brandywine, and we thought about what kind of representative sampling of objects could we choose, ranging from kind of greatest hits, things like the flat top desk, which is one of these iconic works of Esherick's sort of transitional moment as he's beginning to make these kind of massive furniture pieces that he'd become well known for. How could we balance that out with representation from the print collection, from the sculpture that we have? How could we think about bringing objects to people that they wouldn't be able to necessarily see if they couldn't make it to the Esherick Museum?
And sometimes when you're in that studio space, you're overwhelmed by what you're
are.
seeing.
Oh,
And so
yeah.
you don't see the littlest details. One of my favorite things in the exhibition is a little light pole that's sculpted as a human form, and it's this tiny person pulling down on the light pole. And you certainly could miss that in the studio if you're walking around.
In the studio, it's one of many things.
Yeah.
And in the exhibition at the Brandywine, it'll have sort of space to breathe and become its own piece. So there'll be over 70 objects from the studio coming to the Brandywine. Seems like a lot missing from the studio, but when you remember that we have over 3,000 objects in the collection, there will still be a lot to see if you decide to come to the museum while the exhibition is
Yes, and we
up.
hope people go to both places,
Yeah.
right? I think that
That's
would
the
be
best way to see the show.
exactly.
It's something we deal with at the Wyeth Studio properties as well. What's on view is highly favored and it tells a story, but we
Yes.
have thousands more objects that we could show at any given time in exhibitions or changing things up. So that's one of the things that I like in this partnership. I would like to have a space to show off the rest of my collection, so I'm happy to that the Wharton Esherick can stretch and show off more of their collection too.
And we're grateful to the Brandywine for the space to do it.
Yes, it's a perfect venue, I think.
It
We'll get
is.
to that. So we've mentioned a couple highlights. Are there some other highlights within this exhibition that you'd like to talk about, either one of you? A favorite piece, perhaps?
Well, I love that teeny tiny sculpture, but I think one of the real knockouts that people are going to see when they walk into the gallery is the sculpture called Oblivion.
Yes.
Do we have any estimate as to how much that weighs?
Around 400 pounds is
Yes.
what we're thinking.
A
So-
very large, over life-size sculptural form. And it is, people aren't used to seeing a lot of sculpture in the Brandywine in this massive form, and it's a feat of engineering to bring it from its place in the Wharton Esherick Museum, transport it, and get it installed at the Brandywine. It's going to be a focal point, and I think it's going to be something that opens people's eyes to what Wharton Esherick did in the rest of his career.
So is this made of wood, I assume?
It's made of wood. It's a sort of larger-than-life sculpture of two people embracing. It was done after Esherick sketched in the wings at a play at the Hedgerow Theatre. And so he's taking this moment of drama on stage of these two characters embracing one another and trying to figure out how to bring it into this kind of lyrical moment. And it is not only sort of large and impressive in that way, it's also full of emotion. It is, you can look at it and sense that theatricality that's in there. It's this presentation of feeling that I think is so deep. And again, if you only know Esherick for his furniture, you'll see a different side through his ability to take and contain emotion and narrative in wood.
That's great. So we will show a photo of
Oblivion.
by Wharton
It sounds so
Esherick.
dramatic.
It
even
is
the title.
dramatic.
What do you like, Emily, in the show that would be your feature?
Well, you know, I think I mentioned the flat top desk, and that really is one of my favorites. I'd love to talk about that a little more because it does present this really interesting transitional moment and says so much about who Esherick is. When you look at that desk, the legs were created in 1929, and they reflect Esherick's recent travels in Europe, his interest in sort of geometric construction. He only made his first major piece of furniture in 1927. So this is just 2 years. And I'll say, you know, Esherick was trained as a painter, didn't come to furniture making until his late 30s. So this is somebody, and he was never formally trained as a furniture maker.
Right.
This is somebody who is discovering himself anew. You know, after, folks often think you can't discover yourself anew, and we know you can do that at any age.
That's right.
The top on the flat top desk was originally aluminum. That's not what visitors to the exhibition will see. They'll see this beautiful sculptured wooden top. And the signature on the desk says 1929 and 1962. The top went on in 1962, and it was the final top of many. When visitors would come to Esherick's studio, they would say, gosh, I would love a table with a top just like that. And Esherick would say, this is your table. He would take it off, he'd make new legs for it, they would have that in their home. And so 62
wow.
is the last top. And I think it speaks to both how considered Esherick was in making the objects that he made, but how much he could problem solve and invent, and how he was much more interested in the right solution rather than being overly precious with what he created.
And I think it's nice that he wanted people to have these objects in their homes, right?
Well, that's, you know, Esherick made objects that you could live with. He was working on large-scale interior commissions for the very wealthy. We you know, are familiar with things like his Bach fireplace for the Supreme Court Justice Curtis Bach, which is now in the collection of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And we have the model for that at the Wharton Esherick Museum. He also made these wonderful sculptured stools that were often the first thing that a young couple looking to collect art, looking to buy furniture that was nicer than the 1950s version of IKEA, might buy one of those and bring it into their home and think about, how can I live differently with a different kind of object that, you know, not just the mass-produced things that are readily available,
Right.
but how can I bring artistry into my day-to-day life, which is still, again, something we think about as we furnish our own homes. Do we want the mug that's readily available at Target, or do we want that beautiful handmade object that brings the story of an artist into our morning coffee routine?
And you could see the hand of the artist in that sense. Yes.
Exactly.
That's one of the beautiful parts of the exhibition, is a collection of cutting boards
Yes.
and trays. Just
Yes.
the kind of thing that you would serve cheese or charcuterie on in your home, but you could have an artist-made version. And so we've put them together in a very artistic arrangement on the wall to think about how even everyday things in your day-to-day life could be really artistic.
Yes.
Yeah, are they on display normally at the Wharton Esherick? Because I don't remember seeing
So they
those.
are, when you walk into the kitchen at the Esherick Museum,
Oh,
they're
okay.
hanging from the ceiling. We've modeled this display after a display that's in the workshop at Esherick, which is not a space that's currently open to the public. But this also is where pattern comes in, right? When you bring an artistic vision to making something like a cutting board, you are thinking of it as this kind of singular statement. And so when we show 10 of those together, say,
Yeah.
you get a sense of how that individual artistic voice changes from object to object to object.
Very interesting. And we'll get to a little bit about the wood and things like that in a moment. But let's go back to his early artistic beginnings, because you mentioned that he studied at PAFA, and then he went on to Alabama. Can you tell us about that journey?
Sure. So Esherick, I'll take it back a little further. He was born into a wealthy family in West Philadelphia, was raised in a kind of conventional upbringing with parents who wanted him to have a very conventional life. He was not interested in that, but he did manage to make his way to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. He left several weeks short of graduation in an iconoclastic move, feeling that his instructors were teaching him how to be a painter like them and not to develop his own voice. So PAFA, he's not technically an alum, but it counts, I think.
He's like 96%.
96%.
Yeah, I don't think most people realize that he did paint.
He did, well, and that's his formal training. He is trained as a painter. He's trained as a colorist, and he was studying with people like Edward Redfield, with William Merritt Chase, with the kind of major American Impressionist painters of the day. One of the works we'll have in the exhibition is a self-portrait of Esherick in his painter's smock, the kind of uniform of a painter at PAFA. And it's a beautiful painting. It's very much an American Impressionist painting, and I think it's a lovely piece that does not give you a sense of the artist that he would become. And there's many things that led him on this road, but one of the most important is his time in Fairhope, Alabama. So Esherick was married to a woman named Letitia Nofer, Letty, who really introduced him to some of the most important artists and ideas that allowed him to become who he was. And Letty's story is one that we are constantly working to bring more into the narrative of the museum. Letty was interested in what she called organic education. We might think of that as like Waldorf or Montessori. And so she took the family to Fairhope, Alabama, which was an avant-garde single-tax colony where a reformer named Marietta Johnson had set up a school for organic education.
Oh my goodness.
And she went to study there.
Now, what year approximately was this? In the 20s?
This is
or
in the late teens, so
late
1919, 1920.
Wow.
And so Esherick went. He was going to set up a studio, paint, have some exhibitions. It's a very small town. He had paintings. He had no frames. There was no frame shop. And he was given a set of carving tools to make frames. He had not really worked with wood before. He made frames that were much more popular than the paintings themselves. There was a life to the frames. There was a vision to them. And that really, he sort of went from there. He went from there to using those carving tools to create wood block prints. He did book illustrations. He built on a career right after PAFA. He had been a commercial illustrator, so this was within his wheelhouse. And he went from woodblock prints to small-scale sculpture to, by 1927, building his first major piece of furniture.
So will we see some of those early frames in the exhibition?
We will see early frames, including a really beautiful painting from 1922 called Mary, of one of Esherick's daughters. And so that has a hand-carved and gilded frame. And when you think about the kinds of frames that would have been on paintings in the late teens, in the early 1920s, you can see why these frames were so exciting to people. They really have a sort of vision. Sometimes the content of the frame reflects the content of the painting within. I'm thinking of a beautiful painting that will be in the exhibition done in Alabama, where we have an image of the Alabama pines, and then the frame is this sort of wonderful abstracted pattern of pine needles. And so it has this conversation back and forth that really lets you know Esherick is thinking about what he's making in a holistic way.
Very nice. Now, I was also surprised to realize that he was making woodblock prints. How did he get interested in that?
Well, so that comes out of carving the frames. So he is has done work as an illustrator before he gets to that. The first book that he illustrates is a collaboration with a woman that he meets in Fairhope named Mary Marcy. It's called The Rhymes of Early Jungle Folk, and it is a children's book about evolution, which you can think of being a pretty avant-garde thing in, in the early 1920s. And so he carves these remarkably fun and engaging illustrations for that book, which is published in facsimile. Maybe we'll see if we can get some in the shop at Brandywine.
Yes.
If not, it's in the shop at the Wharton Esherick Museum.
Okay.
And he goes on from that to years of collaboration with the Centaur Bookshop, which is an avant-garde bookstore in Philadelphia. He is illustrating editions of Whitman, and we will have images. From those publications in the exhibition, as well as prints that he did for biblical stories from the Song of Solomon. He did illustrations for plays, and so there's a Tristan and Isolde that was produced at Hedgerow Theatre. We'll have some of those illustrations. And so he's engaging with really interesting literature. He's also friends with a lot of writers. And so one of his really close friends is the writer Theodore Dreiser. If folks know Sister Carrie, if folks know, and we'll have some prints in the exhibition, woodblock prints that Esherick did related to Dreiser.
This is a point of somewhat of confluence with N.C. Wyeth, who was also an illustrator this time period. People often ask, did they ever meet, Wharton Esherick and N.C. Wyeth? As far as we know, they did not, but they traveled in some of the same illustration circles. Yes. And so while NC was painting, they're contemporaries, As Wharton Esherick is building his studio in the 1926, he's starting.
Yes.
NC is established, and he is actually adding on to his studio at that point because illustration for him is turning toward mural painting. So not far from each other, we have these two different illustrators working in vastly different ways, but both of them highlighting the importance of artists bringing that artistry to literature. And the Walt Whitman, did Wharton Esherick ever do Thoreau? Because that would just put N.C. Wyeth over the top. He would have loved it.
Esherick loved Thoreau.
Yeah.
We have his annotated copies of Thoreau in his bedroom at the house, right? And so, and there is a strain of Thoreau through all of his Whitman illustrations. So there's a lot. I would have loved to see these two men sit down and have a conversation together, because I think that they would have had quite a lot to share with one another.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
So if I'm to understand correctly, the illustrations that Wharton Esherick was doing were primarily for literature in books. They weren't necessarily to be hung on the wall.
They were originally published in books, but they can be hung on the wall, and we do have them hanging on the wall in the studio. Esherick had them hanging on the wall in the studio.
Okay.
When you come to visit the studio, you will see them there. We are lucky enough to have as part of our collection original woodblocks. So, and we will have some of those in the exhibition. So you will have a chance to see the tools that Esherick used to do this work. And we have in the past worked with organizations like the Common Press at the University of Pennsylvania to actually do restrikes of Esherick's prints using those original blocks.
Wow.
So that's a big part of his story that I think is not always emphasized.
Right.
And the Brandywine is the perfect place to tell it because of your rich collection of illustrations.
And you might realize that's how we started with the woodblock prints. He was an illustrator. And while NC was making these individual oil paintings, Wharton Esherick was making editions of prints. So, these prints had a life in illustration, but like the paintings, they went on to have a life of their own as well.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I don't think, I certainly didn't realize that Esherick was doing and that combination, that tie-in with Brandywine is really great, that they're both doing the illustrations. I'd like to switch gears just a little bit, because Wharton Esherick is considered the father of the studio furniture movement. So please tell us about this movement.
Sure. So studio furniture is a part of a sort of bigger movement we call studio craft. And that really comes out of the 1940s, 1950s. You have a lot of folks who have gone to war coming to college on the GI Bill. So you have this influx of folks who are being formally trained, an influx of university art departments that are focused on traditionally considered craft material. So if somebody wanted to learn about furniture or ceramics or fiber, they might go to an academic BFA or MFA program instead of going into industry. And then as those artists are graduating, they're going and setting up studios of their own, where they're taking traditionally considered craft materials and forms and working on them as if in an artist's studio. These are individual artistic objects as much as they reference craft histories, as much as they may be functional. They blur this boundary between what we think of as fine art and what we think of as craft. They exist in all of it.
Right.
So Wharton Esherick is doing this in the 1920s. He is considered the father of the movement, not because he ever claimed himself as the progenitor of the movement, but because when artists who were getting their educations and were coming up in the 1950s and 60s, like Wendell Castle, who's a fairly well-known name, and really a foundational figure in studio furniture, when they were coming up, they were looking for people who they could model themselves on. And Esherick was one of those models. Esherick was somebody who really believed in himself as an artist first. This is not a person who ever said, there's a hierarchy between art and craft, and so I am only going to do the things that are at the top of the hierarchy. This is a person who said, I am an artist, and I bring an artistic sensibility to everything that I touch, whether it is historically considered as craft or historically considered as art. And that mindset, that interest in not seeing the distinction between form and sculpture, but instead asserting that an object can be both at the same time,
Right.
is why folks really look to him as the father of the studio furniture movement.
Right. Well, in researching all of this, I wondered if there was any evidence that Wharton Esherick knew George Nakashima, who's right up the road in New Hope, at approximately the same time.
Yeah, Esherick and Nakashima did indeed know each other. They didn't necessarily get along.
Oh, interesting.
They respected one another, but they had different personalities, is my understanding. And one of the really wonderful things, we uncovered a cache of archives just a couple of years ago at the museum, and we have this wonderful letter from somebody who wrote to George Nakashima saying, I saw in a magazine this gorgeous spiral staircase you made. Can you send me plans? Because I'd like to build something like it. And Nakashima wrote back, I think you mean Mr. Wharton Esherick. You've got the wrong guy. And somehow that ended up in our archives. So
Wow.
the woman must have received the letter back and sent it on to, so we know there was connection between the two of them. And we do quite a lot of work with Nakashima woodworkers now. I think that sensibility, right, of seeing the artistry in a piece of functional furniture really binds them, even if they weren't necessarily the greatest of friends.
Yeah, and Nakashima really, I think, was looking at the wood and looking at sort of a spirit within that wood. Did Esherick have that same feeling, and where did he get his wood?
Sure. So Esherick started, when he started working with wood, he was working with exotic woods in the way that a lot of folks sort of coming of age in the 1920s, we think about Art Deco and the focus on exotic woods. Gradually in his career, he started working more and more with local woods. And one of the reasons that he did that is not only so that he could work with the materials that surrounded him, but also he had an incredible partner in a man named Ed Ray. And Ed was a logger who logged the Pennsylvania countryside. They developed a close connection with each other, and while Ed was in the woods, Wharton would say, I'm really looking for something that has this kind of curve or this kind of grain. And Ed, they had this really incredible collaborative relationship. I think of Ed as one of Wharton's artistic partners, because he could really look at a tree and say, this is going to give Wharton the material, the thing that he is going to want out of it. So if you come and visit the Wharton Esherick Museum, if you come and visit the studio, one of the sort of highlights of our collection is this gorgeous floor in the kitchen, which is pieced together out of beautiful, kind of very organic, sensual forms. Those came from scraps that Ed Ray gave to Wharton saying, I don't think, this, you might want to use this for firewood.
Oh my goodness.
And
Wow.
so Esherick was able to look at that and say, no, this is something else. And the sort of story is that Ed Ray then said to Wharton, I'm never giving you anything for free ever again. So.
But it also reminds me that he was not just interested in those exotic woods and the local things, but the hammer-handled chair, for instance, is a good story of never letting anything go to waste. So,
And I think thinking that you can find wood anywhere. You can find really interesting, so the hammer-handled chair, there will be an example of that in the Brandywine exhibition, where Esherick bought a sort of lot of hammer handles at auction. And these are beautiful sculptured wooden hammer handles. And he said, how can I make something extraordinary out of this?
Wow.
And so use those for the framing of the chair, different kinds of canvas webbing and beautiful work done on the seating. He actually paid for his children's drama lessons at the Hedgerow Theater by making their seating furniture. We'll also have a wagon wheel chair, which was built similarly. So this was wagon wheels at auction as the sort of shift in technology was changing, these beautiful wooden wagon wheels. And Esherick said, if I cut that right down the middle, I can have this beautiful C form that becomes the leg and the armrest of the chair.
Wow.
And has this beautiful leather webbing that holds it all together. And so this is a person who could look at anything. He did not have to have the material presented to him as is. He could look at something and see the life in it.
Right,
Yeah.
which is really, truly a gift.
Even if it had already been used in a wagon.
Right. And I think it's so interesting that both Wharton Esherick and Nakashima were here in this particular area, this valley. And are there any other people? I mean, I know there was a man named Sam Maloof, but he was in California.
Sam Maloof was in California, but Philadelphia has long been a hub for studio furniture and for studio craft in general. Some of that is the strength historically of industries like furniture and ceramics. Some of it is the kind of amazing academic programs that we had and still have for teaching art in this region. But I think of people like Toshiko Takezu, who is outside of Princeton, New Jersey. I think about Harry Bertoya.
Oh, Bertoya,
So
yeah.
all of these artists who are working at mid-century to really rethink what craft can be.
Right.
Pennsylvania has this incredibly strong history and legacy of it.
Which is really exciting. Why were Wharton Esherick's, why was his furniture considered so revolutionary?
Well, I think,
I was going to say, let me just say from the non-decorative arts perspective, I think, and this is something that I imagine every time I look at something that is technically called craft, I want to touch it, right? And so I think one of the things that Wharton Esherick's furniture imbues within the viewer is that desire to have a tactile experience, to touch it, to feel it, to sit in it, to understand the way it feels, because it's not like other things where we say, oh, that chair is going to be uncomfortable, or oh, church pews, or that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's not a 1-hour chair.
You want to experience it.
Yeah.
And I think when he fills the furniture with that provocation to have someone touch and feel and sit and use and hold it, to me, that's something that really makes a piece of furniture special, and it elevates it in a way that many studio craftsmen did to being an experience beyond just sitting in a chair, right? Or climbing a ladder, or holding music, sheet music, right?
Right. And then he did fireplaces and
interior installation. I think there's not a part of the artistic kind of landscape that Esherick did not touch. The museum is a National Historic Landmark for architecture. He designed the studio. We think about his work with Hedgerow Theater, where he's not only designing sets and props, he's also he's doing costumes, he's doing poster design. This is somebody, again, I think that sensibility, that artistic sensibility, and that ability to bring that into something as routinely needed as a chair, right? it's that attention. I think that's really what's exciting and different about Esherick. Everything deserves attention because you're going to be engaged with it, and so why not make it a piece of art?
Right. And also the materials, he shaped them either using the natural shape or adding to it or subtracting from it with the carving to make something that is really elevated, something that's, even though it's a chair or a desk, there's elements within that are unique.
Well, it's a chair, but it's also a body, right? It's a chair, but
yes.
it's also a partner for you to engage with as you're going about your daily routine. It's a chair, but it's also. And so we don't just get to stop thinking about it. We have to kind of engage with it and think about it and feel it and have an experience with it, which is, it asks more of us as a user and as a viewer, but it also gives us something richer in terms of how we live our lives.
And I think the very fact that these weren't mass-produced.
No.
You know, even things like the three-legged stool, which became very popular and many were made, no two were identical. You know,
Right.
these are unique works of art made by the human hand at a time when, as you mentioned, whatever the IKEA of the 1950s was, mass producing furniture and that kind of, everybody's into streamlined looks and everybody's desk or dining room table is going to look the same. You know, I was thinking about the World's Fair and how he really introduced this unique and handcrafted way of living as an example of American life that was shown off in the World's Fair.
So
That's that 1964 World?
No, that's
much earlier.
1939.
Oh,
So
wow.
the world of tomorrow, and there's a lot of really wonderful photographs from the World's Fair in the catalog for this exhibition, where Esherick was asked by the architect George Howe, who designed the PFSS.
PSFS.
Thank you. Good Lord, it's too early.
We all
I'm
remember
tripping over-
PSFS.
Designed the building. Was
Right.
asked by the architect George Howe to design a Pennsylvania hill house for the World's Fair under the theme of the world of tomorrow. And Esherick went and thought, well, could the world of tomorrow not just be about electricity? Could it not just be about screens and television? But could it be about living with things that are meaningful? And so you have this wonderful example within this section of the World's Fair where you have different artists and designers designing what they think the future will look like, where Esherick has brought in the iconic spiral staircase that is still in the Wharton Esherick Museum. It's one of the times that it left. He has included his furniture in that space, and he's saying, no, this is what our tomorrow can be.
That is really fascinating.
Yeah.
So, getting back to the connection between the Brandywine and the Wharton Esherick, where do you think, besides the illustration, where else do the two museums intersect in terms of this particular exhibition?
Oh, you know, because both properties are members of the National Trust for Historic Preservation's Historic Artists' Homes and Studios program, we have a lot in common, and we have a lot in common in terms of our location, but both of these are artists who chose to leave the city behind, to go out and create in rural Pennsylvania their own studios, to immerse themselves in those worlds. As you're talking about Wharton Esherick using the woods that surrounded him, I'm thinking of N.C. Wyeth turning the sycamores of the Brandywine region into Sherwood Forest, right? And immersing himself and becoming part of that landscape. And I think we learned that a lot of artists who build their own homes and studios do this. They do it in order to immerse themselves, to create their best work in an environment that they can totally control. And so, you know, there are a couple of other properties nearby. Fonthill is Henry Mercer's property in Doylestown, and boy, if that isn't something that he created unto himself. And then the artist Charles Demuth has a house and studio in Lancaster, and he was an American modernist. You wouldn't think about modernism in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, but in fact, and you mentioned my book, Rural Modern, earlier, this is something that I think about a lot, how people who move into these rural places actually have a really great point of view on what is happening in not just the urban world and the cosmopolitan, what's going on in Europe, but what the rest of America is doing and thinking about and caring about. And so I wish I could say they had met. Maybe we'll find a letter sooner or later that says you must be thinking of, N.C. Wyeth.
Right. Let us know if you have one.
Yeah, but just these kinds of museum experiences, whether it's a historic house or an artist studio, where you can go and immerse yourself, and both of these artists really created for us places of immersion. I mean, Wharton Esherick, even though we are bringing these works out of the studio, I think you're still going to get a sense of what it must feel like. We'll use a lot of large photographs to help you understand what it feels like, and you can just go and visit it as well.
You can. It's a sort of perfect pairing to be able to do. We even in thinking about the design of the space for the exhibition, we have as a part of our collection Esherick's paint samples that he used to do. You can see sort of some of this in the image behind us. The beautiful color choices for the window casings, and we took those colors and we gave them to Brandywine and we said, how do we use these in designing this exhibition? So we're really thinking about that immersive sense of space, what it means to create a total environment, the sort of fancy German word, Gesamtkunstwerk, which means a total work of art.
Oh, wow, I haven't heard that.
And so we have that at Brandywine and we have that at Esherick,
Yes.
and so we're trying to bring that back and forth as we collaborate.
I think this is a good time to help people remember that if you visit Brandywine Museum of Art, you could also visit N.C. Wyeth's studio as part of your admission. You can also visit Andrew Wyeth's studio as well as the Kerner Farm. And I think in doing so, it's like you said, you get the feel of the artist, just as you do when you go into Wharton Esherick. And I think, tell us a little more about how you're curating the N.C. Wyeth studio.
Yeah, the N.C. Wyeth studio, we largely base our interpretation on photographs of the studio, but that studio existed for decades. And even after N.C. Wyeth passed away, it was still being used to make art. His daughter Carolyn Wyeth worked there, his son Andrew Wyeth worked there. So when you go in, you'll see what it would have looked like around the time in the 1930s, let's say, when he's got a massive collection of books and reference material and props. He's got a big Palladian window for that beautiful north light. He has added a mural studio because he knows that these days of deluxe editions of illustrated books is waning, right? Photography is changing what people want their illustrations to be, but mural representations, he could use his study and knowledge of narration, of telling a story through art from murals. And it happens to be just at the same time during the Depression, when there is this rise of mural depictions throughout the country as part of the Works Progress Administration. So he was on the forefront of that. So we have the mural studio, and you can see a mural in progress, so to speak. So you do see, it's not an exhibition, or it's not a building that's sealed in amber where it is this day forever and ever, but you'll see different aspects when he visited the American Southwest and collected Native American objects, when he was a mural painter, where he would sit to write his letters home to mom, because he kept a correspondence throughout his life. And then there is the palette that he was using when he died. His daughter Carolyn came in and wrote on it, "Do not change, do not move, N.C. Wyeth's last palette." So we do have that snapshot moment of when he left the studio. This is the palette he left behind.
Yes, it's so exciting, I think, when you can go into a studio and see what are some of the things that interested the artist. And I think you get another side, the more human side of the individual. And of course, I think a lot of people don't realize that N.C. was out west for a while. And he had his cowboy days, and so he collected artifacts. And
Had
so
his chaps and his coonskin caps.
Yes, and he loved costumes, didn't he?
Yes, that's something he passed down to his other children. The costumes are still on display at the Andrew Wyeth studio now too. Every 6 months we rotate what costume is on view, and so there's such a collection that was handed down from Howard Pyle, from N.C. Wyeth, and then collected by Andrew Wyeth. So they could literally dress up and imagine themselves as pirates, or as castaways on an island. And I think one of the things I noticed that was a commonality between these two spaces is the libraries that both artists maintained. They surrounded themselves with books, and this is NC. Andrew has a library. Wharton Esherick's library is all around. He made space for books in the building.
He made space for books. He loved books. We actually have that library recorded, and you can go to our website and kind of learn about the books that he was reading and surrounded by. I think that story that you're telling about Carolyn and the palette and the role of family in preserving these kinds of spaces is so important. Ours is a little different. Esherick knew before he passed that his descendants wanted to turn the space into a museum, and so it is really as it was when Esherick passed. It is captured in the way that it was when Esherick was towards the end of his life, due in large part to the founders of the Wharton Esherick Museum, Esherick's son-in-law Bob Bascom and his daughter Ruth. So we have these kind of stewards to thank for making it so that we can come in and engage with these artists even though they are no longer with us. And we are able to see not just the great works of art, but also the libraries, the paint palettes,
the tools and the
tools
and the influences.
The influences and the way that influence doesn't just come from the kind of high, lofty thinking, but it comes from the things that you live with and surround yourself with.
Exactly. And speaking of influence, who are some of the artists that influenced Wharton Esherick? Maybe Frank Lloyd Wright, or who?
Well, so Frank Lloyd Wright is often a name when people come to visit the studio. They say Esherick and Frank Lloyd Wright. Did they, and I think there is something to that. Esherick had a lot of Frank Lloyd Wright's writing in his library. He was very interested in Wright's notion of organic architecture. So the idea that a building should look as though it has grown out of the place in which it's sited. We can think about something like Falling Water in the western part of Pennsylvania as a great example.
And Taliesin West.
Absolutely. Esherick did not think that Wright realized his own goals. So Esherick's own concept of organic architecture, as much as it was informed by Wright, was much more informed by writings on the topic by a man named Rudolf Steiner, whose name may be familiar to folks. If it is most commonly as the founder of Waldorf education.
Oh, okay.
So he is a sort of European philosopher, was the inventor of biodynamic agriculture, and Weleda skincare products. If anyone uses those come out of
oh my goodness,
out of Rudolf Steiner's whole.
Oh my goodness.
He developed a sort of line of thinking called anthroposophy. We talk about this quite a bit in the book, and so Esherick was was hugely interested in Steiner, who really thought that forms in nature give us a pathway as creative, artistic people to create objects that are close to the way that the built world should be, because nature has sort of laid out a path for us. So when you come to Esherick's studio, or when you come to the Brandywine and you see a twisting, spiraling staircase or curve, when you see something that's kind of torqued, these kind of moments in nature that are echoed in the body, this holistic approach to thinking about how the natural world builds itself, that's really where Esherick's notion of organic architecture came from. And when you come to the studio, you can see that the original 1926 portion, which is modeled off of a Pennsylvania bank barn. So this vernacular architecture is tapered in a little bit so that it grows up like the trunk of a tree. It's those kinds of close attention to how do I bring nature into something built.
And those bank barns are literally built into a side of a hill,
Exactly.
and those are unique to this area.
Yep. So Esherick is thinking about organic architecture in terms of the relationship with the land, not just by creating forms wholesale, but also thinking about the history.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's really very fascinating. And I know, just briefly, we have a minute left or so, he collaborated with Louis Kahn, who is one of the great Philadelphia architects.
Yeah.
And there was a building that he worked on with Kahn, correct? That's on the property.
It's on the property of the Esherick Museum. So in 1956, Esherick outgrew his studio space, which is what became his home. It's what you can now tour if you come to the museum. And he was connected to Louis Kahn and Kahn's collaborator, Ann Ting, who is a major contributor to the workshop, who is not often mentioned in this story, but should be part of it, to create a new workshop space for Esherick. And so the three of them worked collaboratively to design a space. Esherick could, in 1926, be the architect of record for a building, but by 1956, zoning laws had changed.
Oh,
Things
yeah.
was no longer kind of the Wild West in terms of what you needed to build a building. And so, he needed Kahn as a partner. And they created this really special space that is part of our campus. It was built in 1956. It's where, for the last 14 years of Esherick's life, all of the making happened.
Okay.
It is built as 3 hexagonal bays, and it's designed after the honeycomb structure of a beehive.
Oh,
because
wow.
work was happening in that space. And so how do you bring notions of the organic, notions of nature into geometry, which is what Kahn is best known for?
Right.
And how do you marry those two sensibilities together? It was not open to the public for many years.
Right.
Because when Esherick passed, Esherick's daughter Ruth and son-in-law Bob, the founders of the museum, moved into that space and made it their home.
Right.
And so they lived on campus in what used to be the workshop. They operated the museum. Ruth and Bob have passed in the last 2 decades. Ruth, a long time ago, Bob recently. We have been able to occupy that space again. It was always part of the museum's property, but now we are in there, we are doing work in there. We host events in there, so you can't come see it as a part of the regular tour. We do have a special architecture tour, which will give you access to it, or you can sign up for some of the events that we do, including the Esherick Book Club, where we are reading some of the books that Esherick have in his library,
fun.
and books by the writers he was friends with, like Theodore Dreiser and Sherwood Anderson. We did a large-scale performance with one of our artists in residence in that space. And so it's been wonderful to incorporate that Kahn-Esherick collaborative building with Ting into the life of the museum, and we hope that in the coming years it will be fully open to the public as museum space.
That's exciting. So if people want to come and visit Wharton Esherick Home and Studio, what are the hours and how do they go about gaining admission?
So we are open Thursday through Sunday. You have to have an advance reservation. So we only do guided tours. So I'm not going to say hours because you can't show up at those hours. You have to make a reservation either online or by calling the museum, and you will be with a small group. You will have a guided tour, so it's a really wonderful, intimate experience. You can find information about that on our website, which also includes program information. We have a lot of really special programming coming up because of the Brandywine show. I'm thinking of plein air drawing days on the Esherick Museum campus. So for the artists who are out there, come and draw with us. It'll be a lot of fun. We are closed in January and February, and then we are open the other 10 months of the year.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you for
Yeah.
telling us about that. Now, if people want to visit Brandywine Museum of Art, and the Conservancy, what are the hours, or how would we go about?
Unlike the Wharton Esherick Museum, we are open. We do encourage you to come. You do not have to have a reservation, although this is time of year when our hours do change when we switch to holiday hours. So for much of this exhibition, we will be open 7 days a week as you'll be able to see our special holiday exhibitions of trains and dollhouses and all sorts of things that are favorites.
And the critters.
And the critters that are favorites. And so while our historic properties do end tours in November, The museum, we're closed on Tuesdays for a little bit yet, and otherwise we're open every day of the week. And you know, we have many programs coming up as well that you can sign up for online, whether it's a virtual program or in person. So.
And you have both of you have newsletters, and I can vouch for the newsletters. Both are very informative, and I've done the tours at each museum, and I would recommend the tours of Wharton Esherick as well as the Brandywine Studios and the museum itself. There's always a lot going on at Brandywine. I really want to thank both of you for your time and your energy and your intelligence in bringing all of this fantastic information to our audience. We really, really appreciate all the knowledge that you have, and we're so excited to see the crafted world of Wharton Esherick, which again will begin October 13th, running through January 19th, 2025. So you have lots of time. Bring your visitors over the holidays. It's a great place to come and spend some time. And thank you to our audience, and we thank you for watching Hershey's Mill Community TV.